Federal prosecutors want more than 15 years behind bars for former CMU engineer Rudy Warnock, convicted on several corruption charges. They say the sentence reflects years of fraud and a breach of public trust. In their memo filed Friday, they recommend a sentence between 188 and 235 months. They also want him to pay millions in fines and restitution. Prosecutors pushed back on Warnock's earlier claims, saying even if some of his work had value, his contracts were a sham, and much of the work didn't need to be done at all. Warnock was convicted in July in a bribery scheme involving 2 former Canton aldermen and a CMU commissioner. To read this full story and the full extent of Warnock's case, visit our website at WLBT.com.